Does God care when we hurt? And so we look at the life of Christ to know the heart of God, right? He is the expressed image of God. In Him the fullness of the Godhead dwelt. So we can look at Him and we can see the heart of Jesus and we can know the heart of God by viewing His Son. It is quite a lengthy section tonight, but I do think it will be beneficial and helpful to us. Kind of to frame the question a little bit more, how can we believe that God is full of power and love? How can we believe that God is full of power and love when He lets wars break out, families break up, kids get bullied, babies die? The list goes on and on and on of all the difficulties and all the sicknesses and disease and death and difficulties that people inflict on one another in their sin. You know, how can this happen? How can God let this happen? Does He care? So John chapter 11, we have here the death of Lazarus, the resurrection of Lazarus. And we'll just read through this as we go. I won't read the whole chunk, but we'll take a couple of verses at a time to try to cover through this section and walk through together. I'm assuming most of you know the story of Lazarus. He was a friend of Jesus's, and we'll see this here in just a little bit, along with his sisters, Mary and Martha. And the word comes to Jesus that Lazarus is about to die, and Jesus tarries and waits. And when He comes, He's met by Martha, who questions Him about what is happening here, and then He meets with Mary, who falls at His feet weeping and asking Him why He did not come sooner. Jesus Himself weeps there with Mary. And then they move together to the tomb where Lazarus has been buried, and Jesus calls out for Lazarus to be resurrected. Lazarus comes forward in his grave clothes and has to be loosed and unbound, and we will look at this. It's not here in John chapter 11, but just one chapter over. Lazarus goes from there and becomes an incredible testimony. No doubt it was talked about around the town, talked about around the city, but apparently Lazarus himself was a credible testimony to such a degree that the Pharisees wanted to kill him along with Jesus. So to give you kind of the whole way through. But we'll look first at these first several verses of John chapter 11. It says, "Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped His feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters sent to Him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. When Jesus heard that, He said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of Man may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister Lazarus. So when He heard that he was sick, He stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after this, He said to His disciples, Let us go to Judea again. And the disciples said to Him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. These things He said, and after that He said to them, Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Then the disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. However, Jesus spoke of them His death, but they thought that He was speaking about taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus said plainly to them, Lazarus is dead. But I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Then Thomas, who is called the Twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. A couple of things to note, and this is a big chunk, and we've got 5 points tonight, so we're going to have to move fairly quickly. But number one, what about when Jesus doesn't come? What about when Jesus does come? It's clear, John makes it clear that Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Is there any absence of love in the heart of Jesus for Mary, Martha, and Lazarus? No. Right? So there's no disconnect there. He loves them. The Bible is clear to state that. He loves them. And then it says, so, verse 6, verse 5 says, now Jesus loved them. Verse 6, so when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. John says, because Jesus loved them, he waited, left them in their suffering, because he loved them. Now that is a difficult challenge to our understanding, right? That is a terribly difficult challenge to our understanding. We would either have to phrase it, because Jesus didn't love them, he waited around 2 more days, right? Or, because Jesus loved them, he got up and went immediately to rescue them from their suffering. But that's not what Scripture says. Scripture says, because he loved them, he waited, for he did not come for 2 more days. As we walk through this and we ask this question, yes, this has been more of an apologetic, but I couldn't help but as we sang, to look around the room and know many of your stories. And I dare say, if I knew enough, all of your stories. To where at some point or another in your life, you have probably been on your knees asking, God, do you care? And so it's helpful for us to recognize, firstly, that when God seems silent, that when he seems slow, though we are hurting and calling out to him, he may be quiet, or he may be slow for the very fact that he does love us. Man, that is so backwards to my thinking. It's hard for me to even come up with an illustration of how this might play out in my relationship with one of my sons, right? Because my answer most often is to swoop in regular, quick, fast, help, take care. Of course, that's what a loving parent does, but we get a glimpse into the love and the very wisdom and perfect knowledge of God that he knows that sometimes out of his love for us, it is best for us that he would allow us to continue a few more days in the suffering. Jesus makes a statement that is very clear in verse 4, and I believe this statement to be clear, and when we preach through John, we hit this and tried to pull this out. And I say that so you don't think, well, he's inserting things into the text to try to fit the topic. In no way. Jesus is clear in verse 4 that the purpose of this suffering is to the glory of God the Father and Jesus Christ. This sickness is not unto death. Now, does Lazarus die? Yeah. What is Jesus then saying? One of 2 things. He could be saying, well, it's not unto death because even though he's going to die, I'm going to resurrect him from the dead and then it's going to be okay. But I don't believe that's what he's saying. I believe what he's saying is the purpose of this sickness, the end goal of this sickness is not the death of Lazarus. The purpose of this sickness, the end game of his suffering, of what will eventually be his death and even resurrection, is so that God the Father would be glorified and so that Jesus Christ would be glorified. Now, it's a dangerous practice, but looking at it with hindsight, it's clear and easy for us to see why at this point, right? Because we know how it ends. Lazarus is going to be resurrected. Oh, okay, well, that was great. We see now with hindsight, because Lazarus is going to be resurrected, and that's an even more incredible miracle, that it was good, and that because of Lazarus' testimony, that so many more came to be saved in that area and even abroad. And so we can look with hindsight and go, oh, yeah, well, that makes sense, and that was good, and all of that. But do you think that if we could pop into Mary and Martha in that day, that they would be feeling the same way? As their brother is sick unto death, and they think to themselves, we have Jesus. We know Jesus. We're friends with him. We have kept him in our house regularly, and we have provided for him and his disciples. We've been hospitable, and he loves Lazarus. and he's nearby. We'll send somebody to him, and he'll come running, and he'll fix all this. And they send somebody, and somebody comes back. Was Jesus coming? Well, he didn't say. Well, surely he was just getting his guys together, and he'll be here any minute. And then a day passes, and Jesus doesn't come, and Lazarus gets worse. And Lazarus dies. And another day passes. And they begin, surely this is it. And they begin to wonder, what happened? Why did Jesus turn his back on us? Why did he not come? What in the world could possibly have been more important or better than this? So it's easy for us looking back, but it's so difficult for us, I believe, in the moment when we are the ones in the suffering, to ever think, to ever believe, to ever imagine that on any level the suffering that we are going through is better for us and for God and his perfect purposes in his timing and down the road. Jesus is clear that the purpose is for the glory of God and Jesus Christ. I also want you to know there are far more people involved than anyone could have known. There are far more people involved than anyone could have known. You know, and we've talked about this when it comes to our prayer request on Wednesday night. Not that we're filtering prayer requests or anything like that, but as kind of a thoughtful process for us and how we think about people who are suffering and who are in need. All their attention is towards Lazarus, right? All their attention is towards Lazarus. He is the one suffering. He is the one hurting. But Jesus has a plan for Mary, for Martha, for Lazarus. He even says, I'm glad, verse 15, for your sakes to his disciples. He's got a plan for his disciples in this. He knows that just a chapter later, or he knows that after Lazarus' resurrection, that Lazarus will be an incredible testimony to God in all the area. The lives that are impacted, the web of people that are impacted by Jesus' decision goes far beyond what any of them would have guessed. They're all focused on Lazarus. And we would be too, right? There's something about that. In no way am I going to walk into a room with a dying sibling and go, well, what about me in this situation? Right? You understand where I'm coming from. But at the same time, God is looking down over all of those that are being impacted by what is going on. So when Jesus doesn't come, I think it's so incredibly helpful at the very beginning of this. When he doesn't come, that would be when we as his children would question his care. And I go ahead and tell you, this is going to go less as an apologetic for when people question God and how he can allow suffering as much as this is going to be for us tonight. And how we deal with when I question whether or not God cares. So when he doesn't care, recognize that his slowness, as we count slowness, or his slackness, as we would count slackness, is not because of a lack of love, but because of a fullness of love that's yet to be understood. Know that when we suffer, it is not for nothing. Know that when we as God's children suffer, it is not for nothing, but that through the suffering, he has a plan in a way that he would be glorified in us. And he has a plan in a way that these things might work out together, not only for our good, but for the good of those that are closest to us, and those that we love, and those that may come after us, and those that we may never know this side of eternity, how God would choose to impact that individual through our suffering. Number 2, Jesus comes. Jesus comes. In verses 17, he gets up, he and his disciples, and they go to meet Martha and Mary. When Jesus comes, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. And we're not going to get into travel time and all that stuff and how it ended up being 4 days. It was 4 days. Maybe Lazarus died before the individual even got to Jesus. We don't know. Now, Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had joined the women, Martha and Mary, to comfort them concerning their brother. So, drawing a picture here, that as Jesus is coming, He's coming into town, and in town there has been a great gathering of folks to mourn and remember the life of Lazarus. Now Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met Him. But Mary was sitting in the house. So just Martha is coming out to meet Jesus. And Martha has more of she's more emotionally quiet, right? She comes more with a head, question like, this doesn't make sense to me. I'm looking for reason here. And Martha says to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Martha's concern in faith is not towards His power, but towards His goodness and love. He said, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now I know, by the way, even now, since you're here, anything you ask, God will give you. That's some pretty strong faith. And I've confessed this to you before in my preaching, and some of you have said something similar back to me. I don't tend to doubt the ability of God. I tend to doubt the goodness of God or the willingness of God. I can't. There are certain things. I guess my limiter in my mind, in my sin on God's power is I have like a list of things in my mind that God just doesn't do. I've never in my life gone to a funeral service praying that God would resurrect that individual. Are you with me on that? Right? Because I'm thinking this is not what God does. Could God? Yeah, absolutely. We need to recognize and understand that. But her question is not as much toward His power, but why didn't you come? All the questions that may be in their mind of why you tarried and why you waited and why you didn't come, you could have, and even now you still can, but will you? What are you going to do? So Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. And she says, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. The knowledge that it all works out in the end often doesn't console in the here and now. Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And she says, I know. A long time from now, in some faraway situation when everybody's perfect and I've got more questions than answers about how that's going to be like, yes, I understand that one day, far and away later, he will rise again. But that's not really all that helpful here and now. It's more than a knowledge that it's going to be okay later to bring comfort now. Right? Especially in the loss of a loved one, I know looking around the room that some of you have felt that. Just because I know it's going to be okay later, there's not much consolation here now. So this is what she confesses to Jesus. I know he'll rise in the resurrection in the last day. Jesus says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And she says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. Jesus comes, and what Jesus says to her in this verse, what we need most isn't what Jesus can give, it's Jesus himself. Jesus steps in and says, what you need is not Lazarus. What you need is me. That's what you need. And so often we look at God as a means to an end when God is the end. I don't think there's a better example for me from this one than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Right? When they stand up for God, literally, and they're thrown into the furnace to be burned up with fire. None of us want to face that. We sometimes fantasize about these things, but none of us want to face an actual real situation where somebody rolls up in here with the power and the authority and the manpower to say, whoever doesn't deny Christ is getting thrown into this fire hole. And that's what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And as they're thrown in, or before they're thrown in, they say, we don't know whether God will save us or not, but we have to stand. And as they're thrown in, they look in, and lo and behold, they threw 3 men in, but there's a 4th one walking around. And it looks like it might be the Son of God. And he pulls them out. And when he pulls them out, there's only 3. And they don't even smell like fire. Now, we've said this before. At least I've asked this before from the pulpit. We went through Daniel years ago. Do you think that if you could ask Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, hey, would you guys rather just not be thrown into the fire, or would you rather be thrown into the fire and have the experience of walking with a Christophany of Jesus Christ? In that moment, they're going to say, that was great. We got to walk with Jesus. We were walking around in there. We were worshiping and praising Him, and it was fantastic, and it was glowy, and it was bright, but it wasn't hot. I was breathing just fine in there. Right? The idea is the suffering is worth if we have Jesus Christ. If the suffering brings you to a place where you fall on your knees and cry out for more of Him, not just for Him to fix your problem, then it's worth it. If it brings you to a place where your spiritual maturity shoots off like a rocket, where you have a spiritual growth spurt because the things that you're facing have you crippled, where you once leaned on your own strength, your own understanding, and you once leaned on how the family's just always done it or whatever you've been taught. Now you've come to a place where you've hit rock bottom, if you will, and you are learning to lean on God, and Jesus steps in and you find Him there and real. That's better. That's worth it. That's better than if all the other external props had stayed up. Amen? The knowledge, what we need most isn't what He can give, it's Jesus Himself. I feel like this has been said so many times, and I feel like, it's one of my favorite songs by Casting Crowns. We need the healer, right? More than gifts, we need the giver. We need the healer. More than what Jesus can give us, more than a fix to our problems, and listen, I'm not trying, when I say a fix to our problems, don't let that sound, because there are real problems that we face. There are real and serious problems. But even those real and serious problems that seem like the focal point, the focal issue, the focal problem of our lives, God is looking down, and He would rather us want more of Him than want that issue taken care of. And we'll tell ourselves, if God would just fix my issue, then I could focus myself on getting back to Him, but I got to have this issue fixed first. And Jesus is using the issue to open us up to receive Him more. Verse 28, when she had said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary, her sister, saying, the teacher is come and is calling for you. This is verse 29. And as soon as Mary heard that, she arose quickly and came to Him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, but was in the place where Martha met Him. Jesus is still outside. He had spoken to Martha. Martha goes running in to get Mary. Either he wants or Martha wants. It seems as if they're trying to bring Mary out by herself so that Jesus and Mary can speak. But the Jews who were with her, who were in the house and comforting her, when they saw Mary rose up quickly and went out, they followed her, saying, she is going to the tomb to weep there. So they follow her out. Verse 32, then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw Him, she fell down at His feet, saying, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, He groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And He said, where have you laid Him? And they said, Lord, come and see. And Jesus wept. He doesn't go to the tomb right there in the spot as Mary is at His feet weeping. He sees the people coming and they're weeping, and He Himself, He groans in His spirit, and He weeps along with them. If you are a follower of Jesus, it won't be long before you find yourself in Martha's place. If you've been walking with Jesus any length of time, you have been in Martha's place, where you have been at the feet of Jesus weeping, asking why. And I want you to know that it is a good place to be. It's much better to be at the feet of Jesus asking why than to be back in Bethany trying to figure it out for yourself. Right? God in no way says, be very careful how you approach my feet. Be very careful that you don't come emotionally to me. Be very careful that when you come to me, that you reserve your word and reserve your emotion. I only take uppity, pious prayers. Right? Where's that in Scripture? I have several listed for you here. You can look through them, but you see repeatedly, and this is just a couple of them, but over and over, the Psalms. The writers of the Psalms show that they come to God and they say, how long, O Lord? How long will I continue in distress? Why are you so slow in moving? Will you not come? Are you not there? Why do the wicked continue to prosper and seem like things go well for them and life continues to be difficult for me? Why, God? Verse Luke 18:7 tells us God will avenge. It says, Shall God not avenge His own elect who cry out day and night to them? And the answer is yes, of course He will, though He bears long with them. What Jesus is saying there is God will avenge. God will take care of what needs to be taken care of. Things will work out. He will work all things to His glory and for your good eventually. Why is He slow? He bears long. Why does He bear long? Why is He slow? In every situation, I believe there's a different reason. There's a different particular to every situation. But the answer, the banner over all of it is for His glory and for your good, which is one of the hardest things to accept. But it's true. It's true. So Mary falls at His feet, and Mary seeks Him and weeps, and they're weeping after. And you see what Jesus does in verse 35. It says, Jesus wept. And the Jews said, see how He loved Him. And some asked the question that, of course, was ringing in all their minds. Could this man not have who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? Could He not have done something? We must know that Jesus is no faraway God, watching us suffer from a distance, even when He has to do a painful thing. He is not a faraway God who watches from a distance while we suffer. He is not heartless, even when He is the one doing the painful thing. If you've ever had a sick child, if you've ever had a child go through like a surgery or something, and the doctor is having to do something to them that they desperately do not want the doctor doing to them. And you, in love for the child, is holding the child down against their will as they scream and beg you and say, Dad, Daddy. Is that not also an act of love? Is that not a strong act of love? Jesus here has tarried intentionally, allowing the death, allowing days of suffering. And as He is doing that, His heart aches for them. His knowledge even, number 3, His knowledge of how it all works out doesn't alienate His care and love towards us. His knowledge of how it all works out doesn't alienate His care and love towards us. Jesus in no way, as He is approached by Mary who was weeping, He doesn't smile like, silly Mary, if only you knew what I would do next. He doesn't do that. That's a sinister God. That's a sinister God. And sadly, sometimes that's the picture that I have of God. Sadly, sometimes I am that way. If I know something and it's going to be okay, you just need to calm down. Chris went several years ago and took the juniors at camp. I was pretty heartless with them juniors at camp. It didn't take me long to figure out, juniors at camp, man, I got to detach from their problems. They got a lot of them, you know. they'd come to me, oh, this hurts, that hurts, and the other thing hurts. I'm like, well, you're just going to have to be tougher, get bigger, or not, go wait outside. I don't know what to tell you, man. It's just time's hard, and do the best you can. And then Chris came the next year, and I saw him like get down the level with these little guys, and he's like, hey, brother, hey, you're all right. You're going to be tough, okay? And he'd help him out, and he'd go, hey, you get in line, because he's protecting this one. And I'm like, wow, that's good. That's what somebody should be for that, I had this detached like, hey, you got problems, man. Everybody's got problems, We don't serve a God who's that way. We don't serve a God, though He is God, and wrap your mind around this, though He is God who is Lord over and involved in the lives of countless believers and unbelievers alike all over the world. He's not detached to any last one of us. He is the same God who leaves the 99 to be with the one lost sheep. Hebrews 4 tells us that we have a great high priest who has been touched with our infirmities. He sympathizes with us, having walked through this life, having been in the places that we are in. In Luke 22:44, we see Him in the garden weeping before His own Father, such that He sweat great drops of blood, saying, Lord, if it be your will, would you let this cup pass from me? He's been where you are. Man, it's incredible. When you think about the gods of man's imagination, throughout the course of human history and all over the world today, if you think about the gods of man's imagination and the God of the Bible, and Jesus Christ, the God-man, who came through and walked through this life and was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He was the capital S suffering servant for you and for me. And He lay at the feet of His Father, weeping such that He sweat drops of blood, saying, Father, if it is at all possible, let this cup pass from me. And the answer comes back. You must take this cup. Does God say that because He doesn't love His own Son, Jesus Christ? Absolutely not. He says that because He does love His own Son, Jesus Christ. He says that because He so loved the world that He was willing to give. He says that because it's the only way, and Jesus Christ choosing Himself to go that way. Says, nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. We look at Peter so often, where he had the thorn in the flesh and he prayed 3 times and God answered and said, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. Basically, Paul, it's better that you suffer because then you'll lean on me. And as you suffer, my strength will show through you in such a way that will make me even greater in your life and will affect your ministry in a positive way for my glory and for your good, even though you would never choose it for yourself. And yet, I believe God the Father says the same thing to Jesus Christ Himself. So He doesn't stand high above as you fall at His feet, weeping and asking if He cares. He does not stand high above you. He does not detach Himself from you, but He comes close down to you. He sympathizes as one who has been there with you. Then verse 38, then Jesus again groaning in Himself came to the tomb. Twice you see Him groaning. He's in His own turmoil over the anguish and the difficulty of what is taking place here. It was a cave and a stone lay against it. And Jesus said, take away the stone. And Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said, Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he has been dead for 4 days. And Jesus said to you, did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? So He says, take away the stone. Martha, again, she's thinking, but she's not listening. It's good to be a thinker, but it's you got to be a listener. He says, take away the stone. And she said, oh, no, that's a bad idea. You're going to make bad thing worse. Sometimes what God calls us to do in these bad situations We go, no, that's going to make a bad thing worse. It's bad enough already, Jesus. Don't you see how we're already dealing with this? Don't you see what the problems are already? And now you want to go and do this? Again, for us, we go hindsight. Of course, remove the stone, yay. Hindsight is a lot easier to have faith. She's looking with sight. Jesus said, "Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying, and Jesus lifted up his eyes, and he begins to pray. We talked about this on Sunday night. He says, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me, but because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me." So Jesus saves, number 4. And here in these verses, Jesus confirms his connection of power and authority to God. He says that very plainly in his prayer. God, I am praying. I thank you that you hear me and that you always hear me. And I am praying this aloud in front of these people so that they'll know that when I raise Lazarus from the dead, that this is a confirmation that my power and authority comes from you. Okay, God? Right? That's basically the prayer. He is wanting to solidify the avenue that God is designed to use for salvation is Jesus Christ. And the work that Jesus Christ did, all the works that he did, and the work that he did on the cross, he does this as proof of the connection. I am doing this having been sent by the Father. I am doing this. My connection of power is from the Father. I do not do this of my own accord. I do not do this against the will of the Father. I do it with the Father and by his power. But he also says, Lord, you always hear me. Father, you always hear me. He confirms his connection as well as the truth that God always hears. If you pray through the Psalms, you will over and over and over again read and hear how the psalmist says, I thank you that you hear me. I don't know that Jesus isn't praying this, you always hear me. Because Mary and Martha had very recently thought, Jesus doesn't hear me. Right? In those 2 days or 4 days, with that travel time, they must have thought to themselves, Jesus is not coming for me. He doesn't hear me. I thought surely he would hear me when I called out, but he doesn't. And Jesus is promoting the truth that he always hears us. He's never distracted. He's never busy. He's never pulled in too many directions. He's never disinterested in us as his children. Now, when he had said these things in verse 43, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, loose him and let him go. The only one who could defeat death and sin has done so for us. We question, does God care? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Does he care? He sent his Son. Does he care? If he did not withhold his Son, then he will not withhold any good thing to them who walk uprightly. Does God care? Listen, I've got good news. Yes, he cares, and he's the only one that matters if he cares. You know that everybody who's ever walked planet Earth, all the angels of heaven, everything that God has ever created could care about you, but if God through Jesus didn't care about you, it wouldn't do you any good. We talked about this just last week with so many people that are so confused, and they're seeking out sin, and they're seeking out different types of inordinate and broken loves because they do not recognize that there is someone who cares. They are yearning and aching and searching for someone to care. And the reality of our hearts is that it doesn't matter how many people care for us, there is still an aching and an emptiness until we come to a recognition of a God in heaven who made us and who has the authority and power to forgive us and to cleanse us from our sin before that hole can be filled. So I'm here to tell you, not only does Jesus care, but He's the only one that has to care. That's a powerful thing. That's a beautiful thing. It's so easy to see in the lives of other people. I see different times this poor individual, they're so desperate for affection. They're so desperate from approval from their peers. They're so desperate to make it or to have people think something of them that they're seeking all the wrong avenues for satisfaction. When all that matters is they would just come to a place where they recognize Jesus cares. And as long as Jesus cares, that's the only one that they need to care. Is it worth it? I'm running out of time. Is it worth it? Think about some of the folks in the Bible. Think about Noah and the suffering he went through to put his family on pause and to build an ark, to be mocked and ridiculed, to be shut up in there. Was it worth it? None of us would be here without Noah. God had something different planned somewhere else. Is it worth it for Joseph to be sold into slavery, to be lied against and have his good character defamed, to be thrown into prison and wait for years? Was it worth it? Was it worth it for Moses to spend 50 years in the wilderness running from Pharaoh because of his sin and in training? Was it worth it for the prophets who were beaten, who were stoned, who were martyred? Was it worth it for Stephen, who cried out like Jesus, Father, forgive them? Was it worth it for Paul? James 5 says, consider the prophets. Romans 8:18, Paul says, I want to read this one for you. If I can find it. Paul says, I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Some of you need to write that verse on a card that'll fit in your pocket and keep that in your left front pocket just for as long as you need to. The sufferings of this life do not compare to the glory that He is going to reveal. The sufferings that I am in right now, the why God, the needs of my heart, the dissatisfaction of my heart, where is He? Does He not love me? All the struggles that I'm facing, they pale in comparison to what He must have for me on the other side of this. Because I know that He loves me. I know that He has a plan. I know He's not just a big, mean God who has lost control of what's happening in my life. When confronted with suffering, remember that Jesus' flabbergasting claim, this is a direct quote from the book, when confronted with suffering, remember that Jesus' flabbergasting claim is that He is worth it. He's worth it. Basically, Jesus' claim to Mary and Martha is, it's good that you have suffered in this way because it has opened your eyes to better understand who I am. You have received me better. You know how now to love me more. The introduction of me into this scenario, into this situation, was worth all of the suffering. And then lastly, if He was willing to suffer and die for us, we can trust Him with our most terrible hurts. Pain, suffering, sorrow, loss, whatever you want to write in there. In a verse that I've already quoted, He who did not spare His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how shall He not with Him also freely give us all things? He proved that He cared on the cross. And so when we're tempted to believe that He doesn't care, look to Him on the cross. And when you see Him suffering on the cross for you, remember and consider and think and recognize that if He would do that for me, then His arm is not short and His love is not lost. He must have a better plan for me. The measure of faith that this kind of thing takes, I've seen in such a short amount of time with pastoring, I've seen hard times hit people and it drive them away from God. And I've seen hard times hit people and it drive them to God. Because hard times will come. And hard times must come. And sometimes hard times come because of other people. Sometimes they come because of our own decisions and our own actions. Sometimes they come because we live in a fallen universe of sickness and death and loss. But it doesn't matter. When it comes, run to Jesus. Fall at His feet in prayer and weeping and know that He cares for you. And know that if His ways are not your ways, and know that if He doesn't pop in quick like you think he should or you want Him to, know that He does it because His strength is made perfect in your weakness. Know that as He does that, His glory will be revealed down the road. Know that as He does that, there's opportunity for you to get more of Him, not of necessarily the thing that you're asking for. These are hard lessons, but I think they're powerful for the things that we face in this life. God, I thank You for Your word. I pray that it's been helpful. God, help us to see how much You love us. God, help us, Lord, that we would get on our knees in prayer, that we would come running to You and not from You. God, that we would set aside everything, that we would fast ourselves from all the other things that we may think will fix our problem, and we would start first and just fall at our feet before You and just cry to You and let You take us up in Your arms and comfort us with Your truth. God, some of these comforting verses, God, have been so thrown around and trivialized that we can lose the true essence, the true meaning, God, that You do love us, You do care for us, that You always care for us. And so we can come and bring anything and everything to You. And God, when we can't figure out why You would wait, God, we can trust Your promises that it is for our eternal good, that the glory that will be revealed in us and through us, God, is not worthy to be compared to the temporal suffering of this life. God, help us to live as good soldiers, enduring for Your sake, enduring for the sake of those that are around us, enduring for Your glory, enduring because we desire the same thing that You desire, to be molded into the image of Jesus Christ. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.